Hi, this lecture will give an overview of standard cryptographic technique, and in particular, we'll take a chronological approach to present those techniques, starting with ancient cryptography, things that were used, for example, during the Roman period. Then we'll show how information theory changed the game, and in particular, changed our perception of security. I'll mention some very important milestones of modern cryptography. Then I'll explain how quantum computers are changing the game in terms of security. And I'll end this presentation with the importance of using cryptographic standards, and in particular in the United States of America, using NIST standards. So ancient cryptography, it stems out of the idea, the natural idea of substitution. Substitution ciphers are probably the first thing that would come to mind if you were being tasked to try to design a cryptographic schemes. What it means is you can take all the letters of the alphabet and map them to different letters in a way that is a complete permutations. For example, A's become Q's, and B's become W's, C's become D's, and then this is an example of how an encryption of this text would look like. And of course, to decrypt, then you perform the substitutions in the reverse order. Okay. So this, of course, has the same statistical flaws as the ones that we mentioned in our first video on the mathematical background when it comes to statistical analysis. All right, if a text is in English, of course, E is going to be the most frequent letter, and then its encryption is going to be the most frequent character of the cipher. Okay. Now, I feel like compelled to mention again the Caesar cipher, where the permutation that we choose is a very specific permutation, which consists in shifting all the letters by one index. For example, if a shift is a shift of three letters, then every letter is encrypted by just replacing it with the letters that's 3 steps ahead in the alphabet. The decryption, of course, is the opposite operation. So this is a special case of a substitution cipher, insecure for so many reasons, in particular some that we mentioned regarding statistical analysis. Now, this can be improved through the Vigenère cipher by choosing, instead of one single shift, choosing sequences of shifts. So for example, your key is going to be, in this case, a sequence of shifts of a certain length. For example, let's say 5. And then every 5 letter is shifted by the same amount. So that was invented by Blaise de Vigenère. And so here on an example, here what it look like. So if your key is encoded here by that letter, which just means that each letter encodes a certain shift. So for example, C would be a shift of 3 letters, and then R, a shift of however, whatever position R occupies in the alphabet, and so on and so forth. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different shifts, and then once we reach the 7th letter, we apply the same shift as the first letter, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this gives you how to apply this cipher. Now, it has the advantage compared to the Caesar cipher of increasing the size of the set of possible keys, because now it's no longer just one shift but a sequence of shifts. So there is many more choices. But the statistical flaws, the statistical biases that we observe for the Caesar cipher are essentially still there. Okay, so it's not really the solution to make the Caesar cipher secure. Then the idea of substitution can be taken to the next level by, one example is the Enigma machine. So the Enigma machine was used by the German army during World War II, and it's a machine that what is used by hitting a keyboard, and then there's a lamp board that lights up the letters for each of the keystrokes that correspond to the encryption of the letter. Now, instead of applying one set permutation to the whole text, the Enigma machine applies a sequence of permutations. So there's wheels in the machine, so 1, 2, and 3, plus other paths, and so these the beginning and the reflector, have wiring. So it takes each of the positions from 1 to 26 that correspond to letter in the alphabet, that wires them, some of them together through a permutation. And each of the wheels, each of the position of the wheel encodes its own permutation. Okay, so there's 26 positions, and basically every time a keystroke is applied, one or more of the rotors are going to move, effectively changing the permutation that is applied to the letter. So if you just applied, you just pressed T and it gave you G because the current travel through all the wheels, the ones the one that's static, the ones that moves, plus the reflector, and it comes back to G. Well, next time you hit the next stroke, it's going to move the wheels, some of them at least, and then it's going to change the permutation that is affecting the next letter. Okay, so it's really pushing the idea of using permutations to the next level, and of course everything is deterministic from the original position of the wheels, which is the key. Okay, remember, you need to decide what is the key. How do you what is the value that you use that is a secret in order to be able to encrypt and decrypt in this case, and that's the original configuration of the machine. Once you've chosen that, everything else, every subsequent operation is entirely deterministic. Okay, but there are lots and lots of different possibilities which make the key space large enough so that it was a hard machine to to attack. Okay. Now, still, there are lots of reasons why permutation, the ideas of permutations, are not necessarily very secure, and the information theory really allowed us to design security goals that were more ambitious. So in particular, the gold standard in terms of security of encryption is perfect secrecy. And in a nutshell, what it means is you learn absolutely nothing about the plaintext by looking at the ciphertext. The mathematical formulation is that given any pair of plaintext and a ciphertext, if you draw a key at random, an encryption key at random, the probability that each of the two given plaintext be encrypted in that ciphertext is exactly the same. So what it means is really there is nothing you can learn. So it's really the mathematical formulation for just the intuition, which is the ciphertext does not give you any information whatsoever about the plain text. So there's never, for two possible plain text, there's never one that's more likely to be the one encrypted in that ciphertext than the other. So it's not just about whether or not you're able, given a ciphertext, to retrieve the plain text, but that's way stronger, because really you would not be able to decide if the plain text is more likely to be like this or more likely to be like that. Okay. Now there is, though, alongside with this definition, a result that tells you that so it's due to Shannon, and it tells you that in order to achieve perfect secrecy for an encryption scheme, the keys have to be at least as long as the message. Okay, so that is a pretty big pitfall, because it makes it very it's very hard to realize in practice. Okay, it's inefficient, especially when we are dealing with large amounts of data. Okay, because then what it means is the keys are essentially as large as the data that you have to encrypt. Okay, so think about it. When you have gigabytes or terabytes of data, then you have to worry about where do you put those keys. So the one-time pad is a cipher, also known as the Vernam cipher, that achieves perfect secrecy. So that's the good news. But of course, you have that the keys are as long as the message. And the way to encrypt and decrypt, as a matter of fact, is to XOR, so to perform what's called the XOR exclusive OR operation bit by bit. So it takes a bit string as in message as a bit string, the key as a bit string, and outputs the ciphertext as a bit string as well. Now, what's that XOR operation I just mentioned? It's like plus, but with one notable difference. Okay, so you have 0 plus 0, 1 plus 0 is 0 plus 1. That is just like the regular plus, but 1 plus 1, so 1 XOR 1, is 0. Okay, so for those of you guys who are familiar with modular arithmetic, it just means that you're doing additions and then reduce the result modulo 2. Okay. So here's an example. So let's say you have your plain text given by this bit string, and this is, if that's the key, then you take bit by bit. So 0 XOR 0 is a 0, 0 XOR 0 is a 0, 0 XOR 1 is a 1, and so on and so forth. Here you have a 1 and a 1 that gives you a 0. Okay. Now, if you want to decrypt, well, you do the exact same operation of XORing the cipher with the key. So you remember, if you have 0 XOR 0 equals 0, then also you'll have that Z0 XOR that 0 gives you the 0, okay? And for example here, 1 XOR 1 gives you 0. So interestingly, with the one-time pad, the encryption and the decryption are exactly the same procedure, okay? Saves you implementation time. Now, there is an alphabetical variant that I feel compelled to mention, is that sometimes instead of taking bit strings, you can take alphabet, right? You can take words over the alphabet. So then you have to map the letters to numbers from 0 to 25. And then you add those letters, meaning the numbers, of course, corresponding to those letters, modulo 26, okay? So here's an example, like you take this 19 corresponding to T, you add to an F, which really means adding a 5, and that gives you a 24. Now, if that number exceeds 26, then you just reduce it modulo 26. Remember from our first lecture of the series of modules on mathematical prerequisites. Okay, so you take the remainder of the integer division by 26. It's fundamentally the same thing, but sometimes the Vernam cipher is presented in terms of letters of the alphabet rather than bit strings. Now, in practice, the one-time pad was used, in particular during the Cold War. So something typical that spies would have is like tiny little books full of containing the key. Okay, so you have for this to work, you and your counterpart with whom you're trying to exchange encrypted communication need to have the same little book. And then, of course, to know, exactly at which time at which indices you're working. If you're sending, say, multiple messages using the same book, then you just have to make sure that you keep track of which pages of the book you've been using. It's also been used in constraints environments. So, for example, submarines would bring a lot of tape, and the tape would contain the characters for the key. Okay, so you have to take meters and meters of tape, and it caused problem. For example, if a submarine is immersed for too long and they run out of tape, so then it's been documented that in some instances tapes were being reused, and that led to a break of the communication, so a decryption of the communication by enemies. And that's because there is a fundamental reason, which I'm not getting into too much details here, but the fundamental reason why we call that the one-time pad. The key that you choose has to be used only once. If it's used twice, then can lead to insecurities, and enemies can decrypt your message. So that's why it's called the one-time pad, and that's also why it's pretty inconvenient to use. Now let's move on to more modern cryptography. So cryptography as we know it since the 1970s. So first, one very important distinction is between symmetric and asymmetric cryptography, okay? So symmetric encryption is the case where encryption and decryption are done with the secret key. Okay, so remember, a secret key is everything that needs to be kept a secret from the adversaries. And then symmetric cryptography, symmetric encryption is the case where this key, secret key, is needed both to encrypt and decrypt. On the other hand, we know since 1976 and from the RSA discovery that asymmetric encryption is possible, meaning that we can set up the system so that encryption is possible with the public key, but so that is available to everyone. But the secret key, only a secret key, it can be used to decrypt. Okay, so that's a very powerful scenario. Now, in practice, however, it's usually at the cost of efficiency. And so we try to, in practice, use asymmetric encryption only for certain moments in the communication protocol, but we still use a lot of a lot of symmetric encryption. So a lot of symmetric encryption is still used, even though it seems like asymmetric encryption is just much more powerful, in fact. Okay. Now, symmetric primitives are made mostly out of block ciphers. So what's a block cipher? So it acts on blocks of data of fixed length. So for example, a block of 128 bits. That's a typical length of the bit strings that is dealt with by a block cipher. So a block cipher can only take a chunk of a very fixed and determined, a predetermined length of message. And it uses a key and it spits out another block of the same length, and it acts as a permutation. So it permutes, so it means that every input has a unique output, okay? And every output it corresponds to an input. That's called a permutation, okay? And it can be a weakness in the sense that once you know the image of one string, then if you see it happen again, then you'll know which string was the pre-image. Okay, so that's actually a pretty important feature that can lead to insecurities. So it can be inverted, of course, with the key, and to mitigate what I was just mentioning before, which is that the inputs and outputs are in one-to-one correspondence. To use it multiple times with the same key, we have for most design the possibility of using what's called an initial value, so an IV. So every time you want to reuse the block cipher with the same key, then you need to change the IV. The IV is public and needs to be different every time you use it to encrypt a new message. Okay, so and it will produce with a different IV, same key and same input, it will produce a different output. Okay, now stream ciphers are usually made using blocks, so block ciphers as a sort of a building block, but it doesn't have to be. Okay, so a stream cipher is this time a crypto system that takes as input a bit string of arbitrary length. It uses the key to evaluate and spits out another bit string of same length, and it can be inverted. Note that it doesn't have to be a permutation, unlike the block cipher. And most importantly, the major difference is, of course, that we allow inputs of arbitrary lengths here. And the same way as for the block ciphers, an IV can be added to the input, which is public, and it allows to retain security even though we reuse the same key for different messages. Now, the typical design for a stream cipher is that the key is used as input of a pseudorandom generator, and that produces a pseudorandom string of the same length of the message that we call the key stream. And then this key stream is used as if it were the one-time pad. So remember the one-time pad, the key has to be as long as your plain text. But here we use a small key to produce something as long as the plain text that looks hopefully very random. And then it's XORed bit by bit with the plain text, and that gives you the ciphertext. And just like with the one-time pad, the exact same operation is performed in order to retrieve the plain text. So the person decrypting takes the key, produces the key stream, XORs it bit by bit with the ciphertext, and retrieves the plain text as if it were the one-time pad. Now, the concept of asymmetric encryption stems out from the discovery of trapdoor one-way function. So what is a trapdoor one-way function? Well, it's a function such that you can take an input, map it to the output very easily, only with public parameters, but it is easy to evaluate, but is hard to invert unless you know a secret key. So that's really the trapdoor here, so what we call the trapdoor, which is, by the way, it's been noted that it's a strange terminology because a trapdoor usually has a negative connotation because it's something you fall into. But really here, the trapdoor is to be thought as a positive thing because with the trapdoor, it makes inversion easy, or at least, comparatively with the evaluation. But without it, inversion would be very hard. And remember the prototypical example of one-way function that we were mentioning in our lecture on mathematical background was factoring versus multiplication. Okay, so if you find a trapdoor for factoring, then that would make this a one-way trapdoor one-way function, sorry. So I want to say just a few words about what happens with quantum computers. So quantum computers have been developing very rapidly, especially in the past few years. And so some of the most of the ones that are used today, the one-way trapdoor functions, are susceptible to quantum attacks, meaning that, well, we know that everybody can evaluate, but also with a quantum computer, inversion becomes easy. And I mean with the quantum computer, but without the key. And that's really the problem here. So asymmetric schemes that were developed, the first generation of asymmetric encryption schemes, such as the RSA, and also encryption with elliptic curves, these schemes will not resist attacks. They rely on attacks on quantum computers. They rely on trapdoor one-way functions that can be easily inverted with quantum computers. And so new trapdoor one-way functions need to be found, ones that resist the attacks from quantum computers, and then the use of such new functions to defeat the quantum threat is called post-quantum cryptography. That's a term that defines the search for new cryptographic schemes to be used on normal computers, but that will resist the attacks of future quantum computers, and it's become a major stake. So I thought that it would be worth mentioning. Now, finally, I would like to end this lecture with a brief comment on standardization. So in particular, the world has been using massively some NIST standards. So the NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology of the United States of America. And so an old standard, the DES, has been used from 1976 to 2001. And it had a 56-bit key, so these are very small now, considering the power of our computers. It was used in 2001. Really, was triple DES that was used, but DES was used in some way. And then since 2001, we're using the AES, which is the Advanced Encryption Scheme. So for most applications, it's very convenient to use a standard because usually standardization comes with a large amount of scrutiny from the entire scientific community. And so if a design is flawed, usually it should not pass a careful standardization procedure. So when in doubt, it's really good to be using a standard, and NIST standards are good for that. But there are other standardization bodies outside the United States, of course, in particular in Europe. Now, there is a bit of an outlier, one that's been used in lots of applications is RC4, and it's not standardized. It stands for Ron cipher, and it was designed by Ron Rivest in 1987. Now, this is kind of like the counterexample of why you should be using standards, because it was not only not standardized, but also the design was secret, which violates the Kirchhoff's principle of open design that we mentioned in our second module of this series of lectures. So it's really not what you want to be doing in modern cryptography. And so interestingly, it was leaked in 1994. So, but it did, and it was used in applications such as wireless security, so WEP and WPA, also in internet security, SSL and TLS. But really, the takeaway from that is that it's been done, that secret designs have been used, but typically these days we tend to use standards, or at least cryptographic schemes that have been published and that have been scrutinized for a long enough time. So that was it for our overview of main modern cryptographic techniques. I thank you very much for your attention.